For those of us who grew up in the mid-20th century, the image of manhood was often defined by a single figure. He was tall, he was rugged, and he carried himself with a quiet, lethal grace that seemed to belong to a different era. We first met him in the smoke-filled rooms of a high-stakes casino where he sat across from a beautiful woman, lit a cigarette, and introduced himself with 3 words that would change cinema forever: Bond, James Bond. But as the years turned into decades, we learned a surprising truth. The man playing the part, Sir Sean Connery, was far more interesting, far more complex, and a lot more savage than the fictional spy he portrayed. Sean Connery wasn't a Hollywood creation. He wasn't a product of a charm school or a PR machine. He was a man forged in the hard-scrabble streets of Fountain Bridge, Edinburgh. He was a milkman, a bricklayer, and even a coffin polisher before he ever set foot on a movie set. And that grit, it never left him. In an industry built on plastic smiles and carefully rehearsed answers, Sean was the ultimate outlier. He was blunt, he was sharp, and he possessed a wit that was as dry as a martini and twice as potent. If you asked him a stupid question, you didn't get a polite deflection. You got a verbal knockout. Take, for instance, a legendary moment from a press conference back in the early 90s. Sean was already in his 60s, sporting that distinguished silver beard and a bald head that seemed to only add to his authority. A reporter, trying to be a bit cheeky, asked him about a popular saying that men who are 60+ and balding are more virile. Now, your average movie star would have chuckled and given a safe, "I'm just happy to be here" answer. But Sean leaned in, gave her that trademark raised eyebrow, and told the room that it had been years since he'd been to bed with a 60-year-old balding guy, so he couldn't really comment. The room went silent for a beat before erupting in laughter. It was classic Sean, effortless, masculine, and completely unfiltered. He didn't care about being celebrity-friendly. He cared about being himself. For the American audience watching at home, he was a breath of fresh air, a man who said exactly what was on his mind with a twinkle in his eye and a voice that could vibrate the walls. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the American late-night circuit was the ultimate proving ground for celebrity personalities. But Sean didn't treat these shows like a job. He treated them like he was holding court. One of his most memorable appearances was on The Late Show with David Letterman. At the time, Sean hadn't been on the show in 7 years. Now Dave Letterman was the king of the cynical, fast-paced New York wit. He could rattle anyone. But when Sean sat in that chair, Dave looked like a nervous schoolboy. He started rambling, practically begging Sean for a reason why he'd stayed away so long. Dave was spiraling, asking if he'd been offensive, if he'd said something stupid, or if he'd done something during their last interview to upset the great Scotsman. Sean just sat there. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fill the silence. He let the tension build until Dave was almost sweating bullets. Then, with a slow, deliberate grin, he looked Dave in the eye and said, "It is rare that you're right on so many counts." It was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as comedy. He didn't need a punchline. He just needed his presence. For those of us watching in our living rooms across America, we were witnessing a type of power that you can't buy. It was the power of a man who was perfectly comfortable in his own skin, a man who didn't need Dave or anyone else to validate him. But it wasn't just Letterman. Jay Leno also had his turn in the ring with Connery. Jay, ever the regular guy, confessed to Sean that his only impression was of Bond meeting the character Pussy Galore in Goldfinger. Jay did the voice, that breathy, gravelly, "Hello, Pussy." Sean didn't recoil or act above it. He watched Jay with a sort of amused pity before offering a technical critique. He told Jay that the secret was all in the tongue, how you had to curl it around the consonants to get that specific Scottish lilt. He knew his brand. He knew his voice was an instrument, and he was happy to let us in on the secret provided we respected the craft. While most of Hollywood's leading men were desperately chasing their youth, undergoing surgeries and dyeing their hair, Sean Connery became a global icon for how to age with absolute, unshakable dignity. He never tried to be young. He just focused on being better. In 1989, People magazine named him the sexiest man alive. He was 59 years old. Most actors would have reached their peak 20 years prior, but Sean was just getting started. He joked about it, of course, saying that there weren't many sexy men who were dead, so he didn't have much competition. But then, as the century was drawing to a close in 1999, they named him the sexiest man of the century. Think about the competition. We're talking about a century that saw the likes of Cary Grant, Paul Newman, and Marlon Brando. And yet the world decided that the gray-bearded 70-year-old Scot was the gold standard. When interviewers asked him how he felt about it, he didn't give a long speech about fitness or skincare. He simply noted that the public possessed great taste. He understood that his appeal wasn't about a lack of wrinkles. It was about the stories those wrinkles told. It was about the authority in his voice and the confidence in his stride. For an American audience that was also hitting their golden years, Sean was our champion. He showed us that you don't lose your edge as you get older. You just become a more dangerous version of yourself. He proved that a man is like a fine single malt. He only gets more complex and more valuable with time. We all remember the glamorous side of Sean's career. The exotic locations, the fast cars, and of course, the beautiful women. To the public, it looked like the greatest job on earth. But Sean always viewed himself as a professional, a man who had come from a background of manual labor and brought that same work ethic to the soundstage. In a famous sit-down with Barbara Walters, she tried to peel back the layers of the movie magic. She asked him about those legendary love scenes, the ones that had defined the romantic fantasies of millions of Americans. She expected him to talk about the thrill or the chemistry. Instead, Sean gave her the blue-collar truth. He leaned back, sighed, and told her it was very hard work. He described the technicality of it, the dozens of crew members standing around with lights and microphones, the heat of the set, the endless repetitions to get the lighting just right. To him, a love scene with a world-class beauty was no different than laying bricks or delivering milk. It was a job that required focus, timing, and professionalism. This grounded perspective was part of his savage honesty. He refused to romanticize a business that he saw as often being shallow or exploitative. He was an actor, yes, but he was a worker first. He respected the craft, but he had no patience for the stardust and nonsense that usually surrounded it. He was a man who wanted to do his job, do it well, and then go home to his own life. For those of us in the American workforce, there was something incredibly relatable about that. He was a superstar who didn't think he was better than the man who built the set. There is a side of Sean Connery that is legendary among those who knew him, his absolute uncompromising relationship with money. He was a man who never forgot what it was like to have nothing, and he carried that awareness with him even when he was one of the highest-paid stars in the world. Some called him frugal, others called him difficult, but Sean called it fairness. He had no tolerance for anyone trying to take advantage of him, and he had an elephant's memory for a debt. The most famous story involves the British talk show host Michael Parkinson. The two had a bet over a soccer match, a simple 10-pound bet. Parkinson lost. Now to a man who lived in a villa in the Bahamas, 10 pounds should have been pocket change. But Sean wasn't going to let it go. He hounded Parkinson for that money for years. He didn't just want the 10 pounds, he wanted the interest. He sent Parkinson letters, not friendly notes, but demands stating that he was now owed the 10 pounds plus 4% compound interest. He even told Parkinson that if he didn't pay up, he was going to tell Parkinson's wife Mary all of his secrets. Sean wasn't joking. He viewed a deal as a sacred thing. Whether it was a 10-pound bet or a $10 million movie contract, if you gave your word, you kept it. He eventually walked away from the Bond franchise for the final time because he felt the producers were getting rich while he was doing the heavy lifting. He was the first actor to truly stand up to the studio system and demand his fair share. He wasn't being greedy, he was being a Scotsman. He believed in the value of his labor, and he wouldn't let the big guys or his friends get one over on him. For the American audience who admire a self-made man, Sean was the ultimate example of someone who knew his worth and never let anyone tell him otherwise. It's impossible to talk about Sean without talking about the character that made him a household name. But for Sean, Bond was a double-edged sword. He loved the opportunity it gave him, but he hated being owned by a franchise. He grew tired of the gadgets, the wizardry, and the increasingly absurd plots. He wanted to do real acting in films like The Hill or The Man Who Would Be King. When he finally hung up the tuxedo, the world was devastated. And when Roger Moore took over, the comparisons were inevitable. Roger was the gentleman spy, the playboy with the raised eyebrow. Sean was the predator, the man who looked like he could actually kill you with his bare hands. The two men were often asked about each other, and Sean's responses were always a mix of professional respect and sharp wit. When asked if he'd ever return as a Bond senior, Sean laughed it off, asking if he was expected to play Roger Moore's father. Ken Biet rang Roger was actually 3 years older than Sean, which made the jab even funnier. There was a classic moment on a talk show where Sean was told that Roger had been on recently doing an impression of him. Sean didn't say a word. He just froze his face into a stiff, slightly bewildered expression, a perfect silent parody of Roger's more refined and sometimes wooden style. It was a bit of playful shade that showed Sean's confidence. He didn't need to bark to prove he was the alpha dog of the Bond universe. He just had to be. Beneath the savage wit and the Hollywood power, Sean Connery was at his core a man who valued the simple things. He wasn't interested in the Hollywood parties or the red carpets. He moved to the Bahamas and Spain to get away from the circus. He wanted peace. When a reporter once asked him what his idea of a perfect day would be, his answer was tellingly grounded. He didn't talk about awards or premieres. He talked about waking up, going to the golf course, hitting a few balls while the light was just right, having a few good drinks, and then having a terrific dinner. He ended by saying that hopefully his wife would come and collect him somewhere. That was the real Sean. He was a man who loved his wife Micheline, his golf, and his privacy. He was a man who had seen the whole world and decided that the best parts of it were the quiet moments. He possessed a level of fame that most people can't even imagine, yet he never lost touch with the milkman he once was. He famously complained about the lack of privacy that came with fame, recounting stories of fans in Japan following him into the bathroom with cameras. He found the whole thing preposterous. He didn't view himself as a god, he viewed himself as a man who was just very good at his job, and he expected people to respect his boundaries. In our American culture, where we often treat celebrities like property, Sean was a reminder that even the biggest star in the world deserves a life of his own. The industry eventually recognized Sean's true depth as an actor far beyond the Bond films. In 1988, he finally won an Oscar for his role as Jim Malone in The Untouchables. Malone was a character that fit Sean perfectly, a tough, principled, no-nonsense cop who understood the rules of the street. When he took the stage to accept that award, he didn't give a tearful, prepared speech. He looked out at the audience, the most powerful people in Hollywood, and addressed them as his friends and a few enemies. That was Sean. He wasn't going to pretend he liked everyone just because the cameras were on. He joked about the value of the Oscar statue, saying he'd heard backstage it was worth $15,000, so he might have to reconsider giving it to his wife. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated Connery. He was 70 years old, he was finally a winner, and he was still the most savage man in the room. Years later, in 2006, he received the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award. It was a night of legends with people like Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg there to pay him tribute. Sean was led onto the stage by a troupe of Highland drummers, the sound of the bagpipes filling the room. He was 76 years old, yet he walked with the same power he had in Dr. No. He stood at the podium and looked at the crowd with a mix of gratitude and genuine confusion. He admitted that he had no idea this whole movie business was such a big deal. He never bought into his own hype. He was a man who had done his work, earned his keep, and was ready for the next round of golf. Sir Sean Connery passed away in October 2020, but the world he left behind is still vibrating from his presence. He was more than just an actor. He was a standard. He was a reminder of what it looks like when a man refuses to be anything other than exactly who he is. He was savage, not because he was mean, but because he was honest. He had no time for the fluff, the PR, or the fake sincerity that usually defines Hollywood. He was a man of his word, a man of his country, and a man of his own mind. We will remember him for the tuxedos and the Aston Martins, yes. But we will also remember him for the raised eyebrow, the sharp comeback, and the quiet dignity of a man who aged with more grace than we had a right to ask for. He was our Bond, our Jim Malone, and our Henry Jones Sr. But most importantly, he was Sean. To the milkman who became a king, the scotch is poured, the course is open, and the legacy is secure. Sir Sean, we will not see your like again. Thank you for the truth, the wit, and for showing us how it's done. Thank you for watching today's video. If you find the content interesting or useful, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the latest videos. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating better quality content every day. What do you think about today's topic? Leave a comment below so we can discuss it together. See you in the next video. Have a great day.